Chapter 5, Comets and Qames-Hatuf, the characteristics of gutturals and the quiescent Alef. What we want to do first, of course, is go back to that sign that we have. I'll draw a letter, the Samic. This Qames-Hatuf sign. And this time we're going to now distinguish between when do we read this sign as a long A and when do we read the sign as a short O. So let's look at it in section 3. Look at section 3. Of course, section 2 tells you really the rules behind it, so perhaps we should look at that first. For the T sign to be read as a Qames-Hatuf, two things must be true, and both of them must be true. First, that this sign must occur in a closed syllable, and secondly, it must be an unaccented syllable. If this sign is in a closed, unaccented syllable, you're looking at Qames-Hatuf. If either one of those two things are not true, then you're looking at a long A, a long Qames. And so now, let's see what we're looking like. Suppose you have a word, and these boxes will be substitutes for letters in Hebrew. Suppose your accent's on the last syllable of the word, and yet you have a Qames or Qames-Hatuf and you have a schwa. Well, how do we read this? We could read it a couple of different ways. You could read the schwa as vocal, which if you do, then the T sign here is in an open syllable. And being an open syllable, we'd have to read that as a long Qames. If, on the other hand, the schwa is considered a silent schwa, then of course we would make the division here. And now the Qames would be in a closed, unaccented syllable, and therefore we would read this as a Qames-Hatuf, a short O sound. Okay, so that's the problem we have. And here's how we're going to solve that problem. When you're looking in the textbook and you have this problem here, you have a situation where you have these letters, the accent down here, and you have the Qames followed by a schwa. If you have the metheg, that vertical line which will occur to the left of a Qames, and to the left of that Qames you have a schwa, then we're going to read this as a vocal schwa, which again would begin a syllable, and therefore we would make the division here, and we will read this as a long A Qames. On the other hand, if we have this situation, and there is no metheg, then what we're going to do is we're going to read this schwa as a silent schwa, and we're going to put our division here, and we're going to call that a Qames-Hatuf. So that's the way we're going to do it. So let's take an example. Suppose we have a word like this. We have a situation where, again, the accent would be here on the last syllable. There is no metheg under the Alef. And therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to consider this schwa as a silent schwa. We will put a break here. This is now a closed, unaccented syllable. And this sign right here, in a closed, unaccented syllable, we will take as a Qames-Hatuf. You must pronounce this och-la. Okay, och-la. The next example that we have is, again, the same word, but this time we have the metheg. And with that metheg, what we're going to do now is read the schwa as a vocal schwa. And so vocal schwas begin syllables, and therefore we must put the division here. The Alef, the syllable here is unaccented. But the problem is it's open. It's not closed unaccented. It's open unaccented. Therefore, we must read this as a long A, as a Qames. And so this time we would read this as achala. Achala is how we would read that. Okay, now in section 4 of chapter 5, we talk about the dagesh forte and the Qames-Hatuf. And so you've got to watch the dagesh, because the dagesh, as you remember, it hides a closed syllable, and that's what you have to remember. So the first thing you would do if you saw a word like this to pronounce it, first thing you want to go after really is the dagesh. What kind of dagesh do you have? Do you have a lene or a forte? Well, the fact that you do not have a begad kafat letter, that immediately tells you you're looking at a forte. Moreover, it's preceded by a vowel, and that also would tell you it's a forte. And so with a forte, remember, we have to wrap the dagesh to tell everyone, to remind you that this is closed. This is a closed syllable. And so now we have this sign, the T sign there, in a closed, unaccented syllable. The accent's on this syllable over here. So it's closed, unaccented. We must pronounce this as a short O, and therefore you pronounce this choneni. Choneni. That's how you pronounce that. Now, one other thing we have to watch out for is something called a makef. A makef is a raised dash which connects words together. And so in the example I give you, it's like gam and then hu. And we won't put the makef in the first time. We'll leave it without the makef. So it's gam and hu. Let me write that a little farther apart. Like this. Here we have two words, and each word would really have their own accent. But if you connect these words with a makef, which is like a raised dash, okay, then the word on the right will forfeit its accent to the last word. When you do this, you read this word as one word. You don't say gam, hu. You must say gam, hu. You must pronounce them together because now they're connected with this makef, which means it's virtually one word is what you're looking at. And now what you're looking at here is closed, unaccented. And that's what you've got to really watch for. So if you have now, if you have a situation like this, again, we have two words connected by a makef. That means that the first word here, as again we're reading, as you know, from right to left, the accent of this word is now shifted to the final word. And therefore, this sign here is now, again, closed, unaccented. The accent has been forfeited, or really moved ahead. And now we have a closed, unaccented syllable. You must read this as kol, not kal. If you read kal, that's a terrible mistake. You must read this kol ra. That's how you would want to pronounce this. In section 7, we come to the characteristics of gutturals, and you've already been exposed to some of these characteristics. But these characteristics are very important for you. Number one is gutturals take composite schwas instead of simple vocal schwa. So if we had a regular letter, not a guttural, and we have a schwa, a vocal schwa, it likes the simple schwa, like you see here. But if this were a guttural, if you had a situation where, let's say you have a chet, let's say for instance, the chet doesn't like just a simple schwa. Gutturals have that preference for something a little more. They will go always with composite schwas, and or at least most of the time. In Hebrew, hardly everything is, the word always is a bad word when you learn the language. You've got to remember that. There's always exceptions. But gutturals have that strong preference for composite schwas instead of vocal schwas. And it's also true that even when sometimes the guttural will be in the silent schwa, in other words, we'll have a silent schwa under it, sometimes even in that position, the gutturals will still prefer a composite schwa. So again, you want to keep that in mind also, that these gutturals, even in the silent schwa position, at times, can take a composite schwa, which again is not silent, it's always vocal. Okay, by the way, in that first rule with gutturals take composite schwas instead of simple vocal schwas, that usually does not apply to the resh, only to the other four gutturals, the aleph, the hey, the chet, and the ayin. Number two, gutturals, and this time we're including the resh, they do not admit dagesh forte. And so you don't, with a chet, you don't put a dagesh forte or a dagesh lene for that matter, in a guttural. That is nothing, you don't do that. Now again, going back to a hey, if you do see a dot in a hey, you know that's not a dagesh, but again, that is the mapik. So, and the same with the resh here. The resh also will not take it. Number 3, gutturals have a preference for patach, either under them or before them. And so we want to keep that in mind. So we have a word like melech. And melech we call a seglet noun, and you can see one of the reasons for this is that these segols here. And so this is known as a seglet noun. Well, there's a word very much like it, na'ar, which looks like this. This also is a seglet noun. And what you would have is you would have segol, segol, just like melech. But you have a guttural right there, that ayin. And therefore, the gutturals have a preference for a patach under them and even before them. And that's why both of the segols becomes patach because of the influence of the guttural. The guttural, as it were, is changing the segols to patach. So remember that gutturals prefer patach under them and before them. And there you see the example. Number 4 now. And for this, we're only talking about the guttural hey, final hey with a mapik, final chet, and final ayin. So they have to be the final letters of a word, and we're excluding Alef and resh here. Alef and resh does not apply. They take a little patach known as a furtive patach, okay? And so if you have a word and your final letter is one of the 3 gutturals, either the hey with a mapik, or the chet or the ayin, and the vowel before it is not a patach nor a long kametz, then what this word requires is that you have something called a furtive patach underneath it. And by doing this, again, this is the sort of the preference again that gutturals have for that patach sound. And this is really like a vocalic glide to get into pronouncing the guttural properly. They didn't want to say re, so they say reach. And that little ah sound here is sort of sliding you into pronouncing the guttural properly. And so this is known as a furtive patach. Okay, another example that I give is this word here. Let me rewrite that. Okay, this is ruch, but again, you have a final hey with mapik, or you have a chet, or you have a final ayin. The vowel before it is not a kametz, nor it's a patach, and so what it requires is this furtive patach. Notice also how I write it, not directly under the letter like we normally do. What we do is we write it just a little to the right of it, you see, and that's ruach. And again, it helps you to pronounce the chet properly. Now, if this word were to have something else on the end of it, like a vowel like this, then you don't need the furtive patach because no longer is the guttural in the final position. And so this is just ru, chi. That's fine. The guttural has to be in the final position. And when it's in the final position, that's when you get it, you see. That's when you get that. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, when we're dividing syllables, we will totally ignore the furtive patach. So here, there would be no division of syllables. Don't do that, okay? Furtive patach does not count in any way in the division of syllables. Again, it was sort of a fake vowel that's put in there simply to pronounce the guttural properly. So again, it's something added later. All right? And one other thing I do want to remind you, and that is if you had a word like this, again, you don't need a furtive patach here, but the reason why is you have a patach here. And if this were a long kametz, the same thing. You would not need it because it's already got that ah sound in front of it. It doesn't need any more furtive patachs or anything to glide you into that. The kametz itself or the patach itself would glide you in there. So keep that in mind also. Now in section 8, we have the quiescent Alef. And we've already talked about the fact that Alef is not pronounced. that it's a silent letter. And so that's what we mean by quiescent. The word quiescent means to be quiet or to be silent. And so this is a silent letter, and so it's quiesced. And this is true in modern Hebrew, but even in the biblical Hebrew period, these alefs began to quiesce. And with that, we have to watch out for this. And let's, especially for things like dividing syllables. So if you have a situation like I give you, you can tell a quiescent aleph because there's no vowel connected to it at all. When you see no vowel with an aleph, and it's going to be either in the middle of a word or at the end of a word. If you see no vowel, no schwa, nothing. As in this example, there's no schwa, there's no vowel. That is an indication that this aleph has indeed quiesced. And so when we're dividing syllables, it's simply ignored. So if you like, we can split it here, but if you divide here or here, it doesn't matter. And the key thing to remember is this is now just considered completely dead for purposes of dividing. And again, it wouldn't even be pronounced probably in biblical Hebrew either during that period of time. So again, and usually what happens, by the way, is when the aleph quiesces, the vowel before it is compensated. And this is very common in a language. When a letter is no longer pronounced, usually the vowel before it gets lengthened, and that's what you normally see also in biblical Hebrew. So that's the quiesced aleph. If you look down in footnote 3, I sort of give you how that works. You can see I give you the word masa like this. And this is the way it should have looked originally. This is the way it would have looked, but when the aleph quiesced, you get rid of this. And of course, once you get rid of that silent schwa, the dagesh lene has to go. See, because the dagesh lene has to be up against a silent schwa. And then what they did is they lengthened the patach to a long kametz to compensate for the quiescing of the aleph. But again, the main thing I wanted to show you is when you're dividing, when you're syllabifying, again, you just ignore the quiescent aleph. Well, now it's time for you to do the exercises to chapter 5.